are listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. I'm your host, Professor Ace, and with the support of the University of Alaska Fairbanks Department of Social Work, we gather voices of revolutionary social workers from around the world, organizers, healers, artists, and educators, people who carry stories that connect us, challenge us, and remind us what it means to be human. Each episode is an offering, a chance to slow down, listen deeply, and feel the ground beneath your feet. Come as you are, stay as long as you need, and remember, no matter your pain, somebody, somewhere feels the same. Welcome to The Circle. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan Singer, a pioneer in social work and a trailblazer for digital media in the profession. His early work helped shape how social workers use online platforms today, and he's also a nationally recognized expert in suicide prevention and intervention. If you find something meaningful here, the best way that you can support this work is simple. Like, comment, share the episode, and subscribe to our channels. And if you want to connect, ask questions, or be a part of the conversation, please reach out, because I'd love to hear from you. All right, welcome to another episode of The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. I'm feel very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Jonathan Singer today, this morning, this afternoon. How are you?
I'm doing well, Ace. How you doing?
I can't complain. Lots of good things going. Where are you joining us from today?
So I'm coming from Evanston, Illinois, right outside of Chicago.
Well, I'm all the way on the northeast shore of the Big Island in Hawaii, in a little sleepy town called Honoka'a. So one of the cool things about the modern world is we may be disconnected in some ways, but people like Dr. Singer and I are able to connect, pretty much halfway across the world.
It is amazing. It is truly a gift. And I remember it was Arthur C. Clarke or one of those folks, like in 1960, did this movie about sort of tomorrow. And one of the things that he said was, it is certain that by the year 2000, people will be able to stay at home and work and connect with people all over the world using the medium of computers. And like seeing these clips these days, you're like, yeah, that's true. And like we almost take it for granted now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm teaching a class on lifespan development, and we're reflecting on the passage of time and all of that. And one of the things is when I really reflect on it, it makes me feel old, because when I was a kid, I remember having a dream of like being able to talk to my grandparents that lived, back then it was a long distance phone call, like 30 minutes away. And I dreamed that I could talk to them picture to picture. And now that's what I do all day long, pretty much.
Yeah. Well, and I'm excited about our conversation. It's good to see your face again, but I don't actually think of this as magic. And it really is. It's magical.
It is, in a way. You're right. I mean, like I said, if you were to go back in time, our previous selves and what we would have thought about, we would have thought that this was magical. If you went back 200 years ago, they'd have really thought it was magical.
And they might have killed us for it.
Yeah, they probably would have.
Yeah.
Well, you are a pioneer in the field of social work, and specifically what I wanted to talk about was podcasting. You are the trailblazer in podcasting when it comes to social work. And in many ways, I envy you, because you got into it before it kind of became oversaturated. And maybe with this podcast, I caught on that very tail end where it was still kind of unique and whatnot, but anybody can do it now, which is a really cool thing. But it also means that there's a million people out there doing it. When did you get started?
So the idea for the podcast came to me in the fall of 2006. I was in my doctoral program at the University of Pittsburgh, and I was teaching a practice theories course. And we had this book by Joe Walsh, who was at Virginia Commonwealth University. It was a practice theories text. And I thought it was fantastic. And he had so much practical information, and yet he combined theory and he had stories, and I just thought it was a great text. And I could see that my students, many of whom were traveling, from outside of Pittsburgh, some of them were traveling from Erie, Pennsylvania, so spending a bunch of time in the car, that they couldn't understand how great the information was in this book because they weren't yet in practice. And there's something that you can't expect people to understand about a textbook in terms of its value until they have to put it into practice. And so I thought, well, how can I make sure that my students have access to kind of the best parts of these chapters the most important content that Joe Walsh is trying to convey after they leave school, right? I mean, we could talk about it in class. I can the language management system, which at that point I think it was Blackboard, but the LMS, I can have my lecture notes on there. I could have PowerPoints or whatever. But they lose access to all of that when they graduate. So how can I make sure that they can get this information today, but that they can use when they're actually working with clients? And so my original thought was I would record my lectures and burn them onto CDs and then hand the CDs out in class. And then one night, it was late at night, and I was working on something, and I was listening to a podcast, and I think it was Podrunner, which was one of these early podcasts. It was a DJ who had like these hour-long mixes at certain beats per minute. And some of them were like 120, just a classic boom, 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 right? And the music was great, but some of them they would start out at like 80 and then they would go up to 140. And the idea was that you would listen to them and you would run. And so you would just keep running faster and faster and faster and faster and faster, right? Along with the music. And I thought, this is amazing and it's free. And then I was like, wait, I can do this with my lectures. So I Googled socialworkpodcast.com, and I was very glad to see that it was available. In retrospect, the question is, who would have taken it? But so that it was available. And so I decided to call it the Social Work Podcast. And there was a recording studio at the University of Pittsburgh that I had learned about. And I emailed them and I was like, hey, is there any chance that I could use this recording studio to record my lectures? And they were like, oh, yes. We've had this for like 6 to 9 months, and you are literally the first person who is asked to use it. So please come on in. And it was literally like a little party. Like everybody that worked in the media lab like met me. They were like, oh, hi, nice to meet you. Like, come on in, let's show you. It was beautiful. Like you could have fit like 5 or 6 people in there, right? Had a desk, had the mics, had the Sony SoundForge, the Pro version, right? And so I started recording summaries of my lecture. I literally had my PowerPoints on the computer and I was just like clicking through, right? And if you listen to the original episodes, they sound like I'm not 100% talking to the audience. And it's in part because I am literally looking at the bullet points on my PowerPoint and thinking of what I'm going to say. I could talk a little bit more about how I learned about flow later on, but I released the first episode on January 22nd, 2007. And I was teaching another section of the practice theories course. And I told my students about it. And I said, this is great. You can subscribe on Apple's podcast thing through iTunes. And when you plug in your iPod, it'll automatically download to the iPod. It's great. At the end of the semester, I looked at the stats and I saw that there had been over 3,000 visitors to the website, which was a blogger site, because I didn't want to create its own website. And that the episodes had been downloaded thousands of times. I only had 20 students. So I was like, who are these people? And they were people from all over the world. It was amazing. So that's how the podcast started. And that's why the podcast started. And that's when I realized that it was something that was interesting and important for more than just the 20 people I was teaching.
Yeah, it's interesting, the commonalities that we had, because the podcast that I started, the same thing. I'm in class and I'm thinking, how can I do something different? And I'd come from a little bit of a background in radio beforehand. And so you made me laugh when you said you were reading the bullet points, and it was kind of a little bit off, because I wouldn't even go watch my first ones, I don't think. But I was so worried about what I was supposed to be saying, like looking at the bullet points and looking at the questions, that I wasn't listening to who I was talking to. And so that's why I've kind of changed it up. And it doesn't mean I don't prepare at all, but I don't necessarily have anything that I'm supposed to say, and I'm okay with however the conversation goes, if you know what I mean. How did you mentioned flow. How did you change that up?
So like yourself, I had some background in radio when I was in college. I went through the training. I was a DJ at the college radio station, which was the public radio for the town that it was in. I went to Earlham College, and so it was Richmond, Indiana. Richmond's public radio, 91.5. And so I had some radio background. I'm also a drummer. I'd spent time in the studio recording albums, and so I had some idea about music software. And then I had done web design in the mid 90s when the internet was brand new. And so like those three things came together in terms of creating the podcast as a thing. In terms of the flow, what happened was that I listened back to those first episodes and I realized that I was saying there was a lot of me thinking. And I don't have a problem with people thinking in real time. But I thought that if somebody was going to listen to this and maybe listen to it again, which was my hope, and then possibly that somebody else would use it for a class, that there would be benefit in it not sounding so, I don't really know what I'm saying here, and more like, so this is what I'm saying. I'm going to share this information. I'm going to talk about this. This is this. It's concise. Here you have the information that you need. And so I did some editing. And then what I realized was that I was spending a lot of time editing what I was saying to make it sound like I wanted it to say. And the act of listening to myself and hearing what I didn't like that I was saying or how I was saying it and how I was editing things out, in a sense, trained me to be able to do that better in real time. And I later realized there was a lot of parallels to that with the experience of recording yourself doing therapy and listening to that. And maybe you do a transcript, maybe it's a process recording, but there's a process of listening and hearing and really hearing what worked and didn't work. And so that was part of how I improved my flow. One of the other things that I did was that I realized that I was using my clinical skills, my verbal following. So I was doing a lot of, ooh, yeah. And I found that so annoying. To this day, I listen to podcasts, and when people are always interrupting each other, being, And for a long time, I didn't understand why I found that so annoying. But what I did was I stopped doing the verbal following. I did what you're doing, which is, I did some nodding, some facial expressions. Sometimes I would tell my guests, this is what I'm going to do in advance so that I'm listening. But what I realized was that when my guest was talking, if I was interviewing somebody and my guest was talking and I said, oh, that's so interesting, or what I was doing is I was interrupting the experience of the listener and reminding the listener that they were listening in on somebody else's conversation. It temporarily interrupted the fantasy that this person is talking to you, which I think is one of the most powerful things about podcasting, is that it ends up being an audience of one. If I'm listening to somebody, right? You had Alan Detlaff on, right? If I'm listening to Alan talk about something, I know he's not talking to me, but if he's just talking, then I'm in that moment with him. And then when you come in, even if I find what you're saying interesting, I'm now sitting back and listening to the two of you have a conversation. And it's different. So that's the other thing that I did for my flow, is that I stopped doing the verbal following in my conversations when I was the podcast host, because I wanted people to have that experience of just being in relationship with whoever my guest was.
Yeah, right. A more intimate experience. And I've had episodes where I've had multiple people on, and I don't mean to talk crap or anything, but it is kind of annoying. And then also in the post transcript, it becomes really hard to edit. And sometimes I make myself sick by seeing how many times I say certain things, like, or the one that gets me now is, and I don't even know where it came from, but and if I type in into my transcript, sometimes it says it's like 500 times or something. Yeah. It doesn't add anything. Saying doesn't add anything.
Yeah, I know. I feel you on that one.
Well, how are you, how did you, I know you mentioned trying to put it on CD and all kinds of stuff like that, but how are you editing today? Has it evolved? Do you use different things? I'm obviously here on Riverside, and I'm so busy. I would love to, because I'm kind of a nerd in that way, I would love to be able to have the time to sit down and meticulously go through every episode and edit them personally, but I just really don't have the time. I have episodes stacked up right now, and I have to use a lot of artificial intelligence, to be honest with you, which I'm very ambivalent on how I feel about artificial intelligence, but I have to rely on it to give me a show notes and things like that.
Yeah. So you're saying that you use AI after you have the transcript, or you put the audio in and you ask it to create show notes and things like that? I don't know how Riverside works in that sense, if it's sort of embedded in the model.
Yeah, so Riverside, it will produce a transcript for me, and it's evolved itself over time. At this point, you can just click on the recording that you did, or on an edited recording, and it will give you show notes, which basically includes keywords, a very short summary, chapters. The chapters is very helpful for me. It gives me the chapters and things like that. And sometimes, depending on the time that I have, I'll either paste that into a document and edit it myself, or sometimes if I'm in a real rush, I'll tell ChatGPT what I want to do with it and put in the links that I've already got and all that stuff. But yeah, so post-recording, I use it a lot. I should say I use it the most for summarizing the content, putting together some kind of show notes or a description.
Yeah. I mean, I think that AI is actually really good for that. If I'm doing a remote thing, I will use Zoom and I'll just record, over Zoom, and Zoom will give me a transcript if I'm recording to the cloud, but I like to record to the computer, because then what it does is it separates the audio tracks so that I can address that. Now, most of the time I do my interviews, and I don't do video. I will do them in person at a conference. And so I will have my live microphone and I'll do this. And what I found is fantastic. Notebook LM, the free version, you can upload an MP3 and ask it to transcribe it, and it'll do it. And so that actually has been a game changer. Now, I used to pay for transcripts and it was going really well. And then I made the mistake of telling the person that I'd been working with for a couple of years, hey, if I give you this sort of lump sum, can you transcribe, the next 5 episodes or whatever? And they were like, sure. And then they ghosted me. So I was out the money, I was out the transcripts. And what I started to do was I started to ask the listeners if they would be interested in donating their time to transcribe the audio. And what I found was that people were loving that. I got so many offers from people that I couldn't take everybody up on it. Now, if I published episodes on a regular basis, I could have taken everybody up on it. But my output is very irregular, which gets to your point, right? You've got a backlog. I've got like 25 interviews that some of them go back like 9 years. It's embarrassing. But it sort of created a little community, right, of the transcribers. And then people would be like, hey, haven't heard from you. Let me know if you want a transcript, right? And that was a beautiful thing. But these days I've been going to ChatGPT, Notebook LM for the transcript. And then I'll read through it and I'll clean it up and I'll do some things. And that's actually been really nice, so that when I publish the episode, instead of waiting on somebody to transcribe it, the transcription's there. And I think that that's a really nice service, because it means that it's immediately ADA compliant in terms of having text and audio. And recently, I've done some episodes, like I did a 3-part series with Bruce Thayer about research, and he used a lot of terms, right? And then I published an episode with Jim Marley on neurobiology, again, lots of terms. And then Terry Northcutt, who was talking about psychodynamic theory. And she would say things like, well, the average expectable environment. I'm like, what is that? Right? So I've also used AI to create glossaries. So that's available for people. And I think that AI is great for that sort of thing, because you're not asking it to interpret. You're not asking it to synthesize. You're not asking it to do something other than go in there, find the word, and say how the guest defined it, which, these large language models are really good at doing.
Yeah, I found if you give it the information that you need, or that it needs, then it will do very well for you. And when it starts to hallucinate and get into these repetitive writing styles that I find as a professor, and going on social media and reading here and there, it's very annoying for me, because I'm tired of reading. At first, it was when ChatGPT first came out, I used to host a blog site that the students participated on, and the blog started to turn into tapestries of wisdom and the same phrases over and over again. And now it's changed and it's evolved into, it says the same things all the time. It says, it's not this, it's this. And then it will say and then it will use the rule of 3, and it will give you, 3 commas and a couple terms, and it tries to force things in there. And so I see that just constantly on social media, and I've had to flip how I teach completely around because I just got tired. It's just waste of everybody's time, in my opinion, to have to read through those kind of things.
I agree.
What do you think about social podcasting? When I first started out, I had a little bit of a different idea and how it's evolved into, and I don't know if you were aware of it, but there was this, I think they called it the social podcasting website, and it was called Callin. And there were some kind of weird characters on there as well, but it was cool because it was very interactive. They had this, just kind of like on here, but they had a big colorful chat box over here. People could easily call in, and I'd get people that would just be kind of cruising through that would also come in. You'd get a little bit of, people making fun of you too sometimes and trying to disrupt you. But for the most part, it was pretty positive, and then it got shut down. And I've tried to kind of, emulate that in different ways. But I don't get much play on live recordings. I get a little bit sometimes on Instagram and YouTube, and I've tried LinkedIn. It's on there right now, but I really haven't gotten a big play on it like I used to, other than people coming in here into the Riverside a little bit. But even then, it's mostly people that I'm personally inviting, and rather than, random folks or people that picked up interest coming in. What do you think about that? Have you tried social podcasting in any way? Or do you see any
I played around with Anchor FM when it was out, which was this app, and the idea was that you could create a podcast using your phone, right? Which was pretty cool. The software was good, and what you could do is people who were listening could essentially comment, kind of like SoundCloud, right? They could comment on a section, and that would end up being a conversation. So like if this were the section, somebody might sort of clip that and say, hey, so, I think that you're using the word social like in a weird way. So, and, and they would just sort of they would comment, and then that would actually become part of the podcast experience. And I thought it was kind of cool. I thought, okay, this is this interactive thing that has been missing in a broadcast medium, right? It takes the social part of social media and it embeds it in audio, which has traditionally been broadcast, right? And I didn't end up using Anchor FM because there were issues about how, when you recorded, it sort of stayed with Anchor FM. And then if you wanted to like take the audio and go somewhere else, there were some issues. So, and also I already had my podcast thing. So I was just kind of playing around with it, something else. But in theory, I love the idea of community engaged podcasts where you have people who can be part of the conversation. I do think that in practice, there are a lot of barriers, not just technological, but in terms of getting the word out, in terms of making sure that whatever content is being discussed is going to mean something beyond that conversation. And I should say, for me personally, I think that one of the biggest benefits of podcasts is that it creates an archive of valuable information. And I really see the Social Work podcast as evergreen, right? So I pick guests and I pick topics that I hope people will find benefit from, whether it's the first day that it was released or 10 years later. Now, obviously, things are going to change, right? So I've got this interview that I did with Cindy Connolly about research she did on concerns of parents of gays and lesbians. That's the name of the scale that she developed. And Cindy's a queer woman who sort of was doing research about her lived experience. And, but listening back to that episode from, 2009 or whenever we did it, it's very dated. Like the language is dated. Some of the concepts are dated. So I understand not everything will stay relevant or stay listenable forever, but to the extent that it can, that's what I'm going for. And so I think that when you have a social podcast, when you have people in the studio that you don't know what they're going to say, there's no community to speak of, right? Where you've already sort of had shared, where there's an agreement about like norms and expectations and things like that. That can be tough for creating something with any kind of lasting power, unless you want to spend a lot of time editing.
Yeah. And I agree with you that the social aspect of it, having people in the studio, it just brings a different dynamic when folks are contributing and, they have a different take, a different perspective, push us in a different direction. Some of the best episodes I've recorded have been where somebody asked a question and we ended up going down a different road. So Dr. Singer and I met at maybe on the phone before Zoom or something, but then we met at the NASW conference in Chicago. And you wrote an article here. I was going to share that actually, social workers and social media. And it was partly based on our experience there. Jonathan was speaking at the conference and generously invited three of us to join him on a panel towards the end of it. And you did a live poll there. And one of the questions, I don't remember exactly what it was, but is who do you turn to or who do you trust in media and social work? And really there was a variety of answers, but the only ones that had any weight were you, the NASW, and Brene Brown or something like that. I can't remember exactly.
And I think I was on there because it was me asking the question.
Well,
I think if somebody else had asked the question, I probably wouldn't have even shown up at all. So there's a little social desirability bias.
You do have this social work podcast. And you've been around. People are familiar with you. You know, when I brought up your name to a few people, and people know who you are. But I think it didn't surprise me. I mean, I've been in Alaska and Hawaii and everything, and I don't expect everybody to be following me or anything like that. But it is surprising a little bit that social workers don't have anybody amongst their own milieu or whatever that they're trusting. If you look a little closer, there are quite a few people that are putting out pretty good work. Which we talked about in there. So what do you think about all that? How can people get more? I guess we mentioned it's oversaturated. How can people get noticed, and how can we get social workers to rely on each other a little bit more often?
So I think there are a couple of things. One, I think that when we think about practicing social workers, there's a continuum. And that continuum is people who are kind of doing it as a job, right? And there is very little interest in spending time or energy to kind of think about the concepts, to engage with the concepts outside of the workday, all the way to people who are, spending thousands of dollars going to trainings, and they go to retreats, and like all their friends are social workers, and they just sort of like they kind of live and breathe it. So I think those are sort of the ends. I think for most people, if you spend all day talking and listening to people, at the end of the day, sometimes you just don't want to talk or listen, right? And you certainly don't want to talk or listen about social work. Now, it doesn't mean you don't want to go hang out with social workers to be able to let off steam. I think there's a huge benefit to that. But I think that, the social work related podcasts that I've heard, they, for the most part, dig into serious topics. Right. So, they're talking about topics that I think people should be thinking about. They talk about abolition. They talk about defunding the police. They talk about white supremacy. They talk about the family carceral system, about, a whole bunch of things, right? Not just sort of like big macro issues, and I think at the end of the day, probably most social workers, if they're engaging in any sort of self-care, are less likely to turn to those podcasts as kind of their go-to. So one way of interpreting the results or the findings from that poll is that the people that social workers are turning to for podcasting, it's okay that they're not turning to social workers because they're turning to somebody else, right? The flip side of that is maybe social workers are not talking about what I think of as probably the most important and interesting things on our planet in a way that's interesting and engaging to others. And that includes social workers. And if that's the case, that's really on the podcasters. So there are a lot of different ways that people create podcasts, right? Create content. There is what you and I are doing, which is an interview podcast. And that's mostly what I do. Every once in a while, I will do kind of a lecture style podcast where it's just me talking about an issue. Then there is something that is called a chat cast, where you have several people sitting around chatting, right? And there are a lot of popular podcasts that have that format, right? Pod Save America, all the ones where you see the folks sitting on the couch and they're just chatting, and there's some funny stuff and they talk about issues, but they tend to go on for a while. And then there is a podcast style that, to my knowledge, no social worker has ever done. And that's what I call the narrative podcast. And that is where you have a topic that you are addressing in a story form. So for example, let's say you wanted to talk about client confidentiality. Instead of saying, So today we've got Frederick Reamer, famous social work ethicist, talking about confidentiality, or Alan Barsky, or my supervisor, whoever it is, right? That would be the interview style, or the lecture style would be, I looked up on Wikipedia, I went to this book, I asked ChatGPT, here's some information I think is important for you to know. The narrative style would be, so today we're talking about confidentiality, and one of the big aspects of confidentiality is this idea of when do you have to break confidentiality in order to either protect your client's safety, or somebody else's safety. And our story starts in California in the early 1970s, right? And then what you do is you tell the story of Tarasoff, right? And you have sound effects, and you weave a narrative that actually engages the audience in a real life story about somebody who did something, and then the ripple effect, right? And I know why people don't do that, because it takes a lot of time, and it takes skill that we do not have, right? Not that we couldn't, but we're just not trained in that, right? And so I think that if we had more of that kind of engaging narrative storytelling kind of episode, you might actually find that social workers would be interested in listening to it after hours, because there's a level of entertainment while you're being educated, what KRS-One used to call edutainment, that might work for them, on their drive home. But I wouldn't blame anybody for not wanting to tune into you or me talking about some big, heavy topic on their way home.
Yeah, very well said. I do think like what you mentioned about archives is important. I think when I was going through undergraduate and my master's degree, like early 2010s, 2005 to 2000, when I'd look on YouTube for certain subjects, to help me study or something, it was very, very thin. And so I'm sure that your episodes are played all the time in college classrooms, and students are able to look them up. And yeah, some may be inaccessible for some or become outdated, but having that there and the opportunities there for students to listen to different perspectives and different subjects that go outside of the one boring YouTube video that's up there and their textbook, you know what I mean? It provides them options and opportunities. But one of the things personally for me that it does for me at this point, when I started out, you ask some friends and some people, some acquaintances, and then you kind of work your way up and you do things. But what it's done for me is it's helped me become more connected to people like you and various other folks that I talk to. And like I think about it now, I know you're on what, episode 148, so I'm about halfway where you're at 70s or something like that. But that means I've talked to 70 really incredible individuals all around the world that have contributed to my worldview, my understanding. So it's a real blessing and a privilege on my part. And I just try to extend that to the audience and my students, and try to provide some conversations that some people are interested in. I know everybody's not going to be. We're a niche of a niche, if you know what I mean. So I get it. One last question I really wanted to have about podcasting is, obviously there's conflicting things going on in the world. There's an event that happened just the other day. There's wars going on, all kinds of things that are dividing us. We could make a really long list. And sometimes I don't view, somebody asked this question, I think, or maybe you asked it when we were on the panel at the conference, was about activism and things like that. And I don't see myself as an activist in that sense. And I think that's actually I see myself as less than an activist as when I started. And I see it as when I have somebody come on the episode, I'm inviting them into my house, essentially, my home, and I want them to feel comfortable. And the only way that we really move forward one of the only ways we move forward from my perspective is to be able to hear different diverse perspectives. But sometimes people don't like that. And they think, oh, Professor Ace, a Christian, you should have called that person out and you should have said it. And once in a while I will call something out that I feel called to, but I do it on my own and not at the guest's expense, if that makes sense. But like, say something like Israel-Palestine, I have Alan Detlef on, and he talks about Israel-Palestine. And then I have a student who hears it, who's from a Jewish background, and they say, hey, that hurt my feelings, or I don't appreciate the way that was talked about. Right. I guess just a long-winded question. What do you think about that? And how do you navigate that in a respectful, honorable way?
So I think there are several things. Number one, I think that I I agree with you in sort of your stance with your guests, right? There's a way in which I am with my guests in the same way that I am with my clients, right? My job is to really start where they are. They're the ones that I've invited on. They have a perspective. I like to know something about what they're talking about so that I can help to ask clarifying questions or say, you know what, you said this. Could you tell us what that means, or what does that look like, right? So I can unpack for the audience, but it's not my place to invite somebody on and then argue with them on the podcast. It doesn't do anybody any good. Now, if I set it up and say, today we're going to have a debate. And several years ago, I actually set up a Facebook Live where we had two pairs debating, essentially bringing up different topics about social work's role in policing. And Alan Detlef was one of those folks, and Charles Lewis and Terry Mizrahi and Laura Abrams, and they were sharing their perspectives about whether or not social work could be involved in policing. And this was the context was this was post George Floyd, and it was an important conversation, but it was set up to be a debate. And these were folks who had written on it. They thought about it. This was, it was I felt very grateful to be listening to it and being part of the debate. Now, the other part that you brought up was, what is it like for people listening to an episode? And I think that is essential for podcasters to consider. And so there are a lot of different ways that I think that we as podcasters can go about this. And they can fall on a continuum of kind of co-creation to not co-creation. I don't know what the other word would be. We write about this a little bit in the co-edited text that I did with Mim Fox this year, 2025, called Podcasting and Social Work Education. The idea is that as the podcaster, we have a lot of power in the same way that as professors, we have power in the classroom, and as the social workers in a professional context, we have power. And so what does it mean to co-construct or co-create a podcast? And so if you have a guest that is saying something that either you disagree with or you know is going to be controversial, maybe you know something about your listeners and you will imagine that content will kind of rile them up or be traumatizing in some way. I think that there is a question that the podcaster has to come to terms with. This is sort of an ethical question. To what extent do I prepare the listener for what they are about to hear? And that can happen in the intro, which you and I, we both record our intros afterwards. And there's an old saying, right, that the best format for a lecture is, right, you tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them, right? So I think that if in a situation like, let's say you and I talk about Israel-Palestine, and I say something that is incredibly offensive and disregarding of Palestinians, for example, you might decide, okay, in the beginning, I want to prep my listeners that this topic is going to come up. In the moment, I don't know that you have a responsibility to represent the other side or the perspective of anybody else listening. And the decision whether or not to represent your personal perspective, that's where the ethics comes in, right? Are you being authentically you in your conversation if you are holding back? Now, as social workers in our work with clients, I hold back all the time because it's not actually about me, right? So that's one answer, right? That is sort of the ethical answer, or that is one of the ethical answers. The other version of that is by not responding or by not pushing back, then you might lose the opportunity for deeper insight, or you set up a space where it sounds like there is tacit agreement with something that perhaps is harmful or inconsistent with social work values. So I don't know if that answers your question. I kind of forgot what the original question was, but that's where my brain went with it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely good. I appreciate it. I appreciate the insight. We have a couple questions that popped up in about podcasts real quick. David and Casey both want to know any other podcasts that you recommend. social work podcasts?
Yeah. So let me just say that I think one of the things about social work podcasts is that, as you know, Ace, podcasting takes a lot of time and energy, and it is a side project for everybody that I know that does podcasts as a social worker. And so there are a lot of podcasts that have started and then stopped. And some of them are still available, some of them are not. I really enjoyed a lot of episodes of the Melanated Social Work podcast. So, for example, like one of the episodes, they had Adrienne Marie Brown, who is, I think, a phenomenal writer, and the interview was really interesting, right? So they've had some guests like that. They also really unpacked a bunch of issues around racism and within social work education, social work practice, kind of the field was great. Shimon Cohen has the Doing the Work podcast that I really enjoy. And I think that he was one of the first to really kind of lean into what I would say is the kind of the abolitionist framework or sort of perspective in social work in terms of a podcast. And so he had a lot of guests that addressed issues such as, well, Alan Detlef was on there. You had other folks talking about sort of anti-Black racism. You had Kristen Brock Petrocius talking about deep canvassing around issues of racism, sort of addressing it as a white person who was going in and having conversations that change minds. I should say this was part of her dissertation work, and she's published her dissertation. The effects are amazing for this kind of work, which again, I think is really cool. My co-editor for the book, Mim Fox, she has the Social Work Stories podcast, which is a fascinating framework where she and her co-host would have social workers come on and anonymously tell stories about their experiences. And then Mim and Liz would kind of process the stories and sort of deconstruct or unpack them and raise all sorts of issues. So again, very different podcasts. So those are some of the ones that I would recommend checking out. The Melanated Social Work podcast is no longer being produced. I think it's still available. Social Work Stories is still out there. I don't think Shimon has published a new episode of Doing the Work recently, but it's still live, if that makes sense. And I think that the intent is for him to continue to do it.
Yeah, great options for everyone. I think, there's several more out there. If you Google social work podcast, or you go to whatever podcasting network, and also just check out the future episodes of this for the rest of the season. There's a couple really good podcasters have a completely different take than either Jonathan or I on podcasting and whatnot. And I've had other people reach out to me for the spring, so they'll be oncoming. So if you stay tuned on here, you'll be introduced to some more podcasters.
I will also say that Melanie Sage had a Google Sheets for a long time that was being updated with social work related podcasts. I don't know if it's still active, but that would be something else to look up as a resource.
Jessie says that she thinks that podcasting gives a way for people to connect with the profession in other ways outside of the classroom and in a professional setting. Are there any particular memorable interviews for you on your podcast, and what were they? And I'll put your I'm going to put the link to your podcast again if people want to go check it out.
Yeah. Well, similar to what Ace said, who was it? Jesse asked the question. Yeah. So Jesse, similar to what Ace said, one of the big gifts of doing the podcast is that I feel like I have expanded my network, met amazing people. I have learned so much from being part of these interviews. And in part, it's because I do edit my interviews. And so I end up listening to each interview multiple times before it goes live. And so it just sort of seeps in. But, I talked with Barbara Jones, who at the time was a professor at University of Texas at Austin. Currently, she's the dean at Boston University School of Social Work. And she was talking about pediatric oncology social work. And, she told some stories that were really intense, but she said something that I had not realized. And again, this episode is, at this point, maybe 15 years old, but she said that when she started her work, that about 80% of kids who got cancer died. But at the time of the podcast, she said only 20% died. Not that 20% is an insignificant number. Obviously, every single one of those kids who died sort of leaves an entire community that's devastated. But that 80% of kids with cancer survive. And I suspect that number is probably increased. And so that the field of pediatric oncology actually extends way beyond childhood now. And what are the sequelae of having had chemotherapy or radiation when you were 3, and you don't actually have a memory of having had cancer, but it has affected your body and your health in ways that have changed your life course, right? So that was just in terms of content, that was very like deep and profound for me. And I've actually had several people message me that they have decided to go into pediatric oncology social work as a result of that episode, which again is amazing. You know, another episode that I loved was, and I'm forgetting the woman's name now, but she was talking about religion and spirituality in African American communities. And she said something like, you know, a lot of social workers are afraid to ask questions about religion and spirituality, but you don't have to be, because your clients are going to bring it up. And the only thing you need to know how to say afterwards is, tell me more. And the way she said it and the simplicity with which she said it was really paradigm shifting. It was, again, not a new concept, but it was a reminder that for almost anything that we do, there is a way that you can open space and not feel like you have to be the expert. And again, and not ask your clients to teach you, right? But to say, I'm curious. This sounds important to you. Tell me more. They could say, no, that's fine. There you go. Move on. But if you open up that space, that's what we're doing. And so that again was a profoundly moving conversation. And I could go on. I could go on, Jesse. Each one of these, each episode, I love each episode for different reasons.
That episode that you just mentioned, it's interesting because I teach a practice class. I picked up the practice classes recently, and one of the number one pieces of advice I give to the students is learn how to say, tell me more. Tell me more about this, because students will, I'm sure you know, students will get flustered and they'll trying to think and they'll be saying all these things and these either ors. All you have to say is tell me more. It can help you learn more information. If you don't know what to say or what to ask, you can have some time to gather your thoughts and listen to some more information. Some of the most profound lessons in social work are the most simple ones. That tell me more is vital and important.
It is.
Well, we've been talking about podcasting for a long time, but I don't feel like we have gotten a chance to know you yet, Dr. Singer. Where were you before all of this, and where did you come from, and how did you get into social work?
Yeah. So let's see. How can I talk about from DNA to this afternoon in a way that'll be interesting? So, I was born in Bloomington, Indiana, and my dad was getting his Ph.D. in physics at IU, Indiana University. My mom was working at IU, and she was also getting a master's in music performance at DePauw. And then we moved to Alexandria, Virginia. My dad got a postdoc at the Naval Research Lab, and my mom she continued being a gigging musician. So I grew up in Alexandria. I went to T.C. Williams High School of Remember the Titans fame, and Denzel Washington's character, Coach Boone. Coach Boone was my driver's ed coach. So that's a little fun fact I like to throw out there. And I went back to Indiana for college. I went to Earlham College, which is in Richmond, Indiana, home of WECI, Richmond's public radio. And there I thought I was going to major in Japanese studies. It was the 80s. Japan was all the rage. I was fascinated by Japanese music. I'm a drummer. And so koto drumming and Japanese art. And I had sort of in the year or two before college been experienced sushi for the first time, probably a Molly Ringwald Breakfast Club effect. But it wasn't to be, because I couldn't learn. And I was pretty despondent. And so I was talking with my mom. She was visiting Earlham, and she said, so what do you want to major in? For everybody listening who's like, wait, you didn't know what you wanted to major in when you went to college? Yes, that's how it used to be. You did not have to declare your major when you were 16. So I didn't know. And so she took the course catalog and she asked me to circle every class that was offered that I wanted to take. And at the end, she counted up the classes, and the major that allowed me to take the most number of those classes was the one that I majored in. And it turned out to be this interdepartmental major or interdisciplinary major called Human Development and Social Relations. And the reason why I'm telling this story is that I've come to realize that HDSR was kind of a liberal arts social work degree. And what it did is it taught me how to synthesize information, to think expansively, to understand lots of different disciplinary perspectives. Because, for example, I took a development of morals class that was taught by a philosophy professor and a professor of developmental psychology. There were other classes that were team taught, but really the idea was that we had to take classes in different disciplines and learn from those perspectives. And social work, which I ended up getting into a couple years after graduating. So I guess the story, so I graduated, I ended up in France, went to the Regional Music Conservatory for jazz drumming, and I learned French. And then I came and I accidentally moved to Austin, Texas. I was visiting some friends and then I never left. And I worked for Clean Water Action doing environmental organizing around recycling and clean water and things like that. And the thing that I loved the most about the environmental organizing was when I was going door to door and I was talking with families, it was really their stories. And somebody said, you should really be a social worker, like if that's what you really like. And UT Austin was in Austin, so I applied. Some folks listening might be surprised to know that they rejected me. I got my application rejected, and I told my mom, I was like, I was rejected, but it's okay. I'm going to reapply. And she said, why did you get rejected? I said, I don't know. And she said, so you're going to reapply to a program that rejected you without knowing why they rejected you. I said, well, when you put it that way, it doesn't sound like the best strategy, but I don't know, like they didn't send me a letter saying we rejected you for this reason and that reason, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, well, they're not going to put it in a letter. Go make an appointment with them. I was like, what? And so this is where having somebody who knows how the system works is really valuable. Because my mom had worked at Indiana University as an advisor in the political science department, she knew that it was totally reasonable for students to come ask questions about why certain decisions were made. And so I went, I made an appointment with the MSW director, and he said, well, I can't actually find any reason why we would have rejected you. Are you still interested in coming? I was like, yeah. And so he literally made a phone call. He's like, yeah, hey, have we had any drops? We did? Okay. Yeah, no, I have a prospective student here. Yeah, hold on. He's like, so if you say yes, you're in. I was like, yes. He's like, okay, yeah. Yeah, his name's Jonathan Singer. Okay, great. He hung up the phone. He's like, orientation is on Tuesday. And I had already told my boss that I'd like signed a contract for another year. I'd done all these things. And so then I started my MSW program, and I thought, this is fantastic. Like I felt like I was totally in the right place. And all the skills that I had learned in my undergrad just like were super helpful. And then afterwards, after I graduated, I was looking for a job. Austin is awash with social workers. There's so many social workers. Like I think I was there 93 to 2004. I think sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s, I read something that there were more per capita social workers in Austin, Texas than there were in any other city other than New York. And so I was looking for a job. I couldn't find anything, and I was applying, and I heard that the CAPE team, the Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Emergency Team, was hiring relief workers. And these were people who, after the crisis workers had been on for too many hours, they would call the relief workers. The relief workers would come in and do the suicide risk assessments and the crisis work. And I thought, oh, okay, I could do that. So I went in for the interview, and as it turned out, there was a job opening for somebody that spoke Spanish. Now, luckily, I'd lived in Mexico when I was a kid, and I was bilingual. And so I told them, and they were like, hold on a second. So they brought the receptionist in, and they said, can you talk to this guy? I think they wanted to make sure that this wasn't like some formal like social work Spanish thing that I had like prepared. And so she just chatted with me for like 5 minutes about whatever. And at the end, she was like, yeah, he speaks Spanish. So they offered me a full-time job. And that's how I started working with suicidal kids and their families. Fast forward to 9/11, which we just had the anniversary, but the actual event, it was such a shocking moment in the United States that I and my colleagues, we did what everybody was doing, which was we were sort of reevaluating what it meant to be an American, what it meant to feel safe, were we really doing things that were important, right? And my classmate Nate, who was a working social worker, a phenomenal guy, he and I co-authored. We decided that we were going to create a syllabus for a crisis intervention class because we were both doing crisis work and we never had a crisis intervention class in our MSW program, which was odd because the only kind of client that every single social worker will work with is someone in crisis. And it was just odd that that was not a course that they offered in our program. And I suspect some of the people listening to this episode will be like, that's interesting because, yeah, I didn't get a crisis intervention class either. So created this course. I sent it to the folks at UT Austin. At that point, I was an internship supervisor. So I sent it to my contact and they looked at it and they were like, hey, Jonathan, we got the syllabus. It sucks. This is a terrible syllabus. You've got them buying 3 textbooks. There are 12 assignments. You're requiring them to do ride-outs every other week with a different emergency service. This is never going to work. It's like, so then they partnered me up with somebody and got it to the point where it was a workable syllabus. And then they actually invited me to teach it. And while I was prepping for the class, I realized that there were no empirically supported interventions for families with suicidal youth. And I was complaining to David Springer, who was at the time the associate dean, and Barbara White, who was the dean. And I was like, can you believe that there are no empirically supported interventions for families with suicidal kids? And they were like, yeah, we can. I was like, wait, why? And they said, well, first of all, doing research on the topic of suicide is really hard to do, right? Human subjects, institutional review boards, they have to make sure there's lots of protections in place. And when your participants are by definition at risk for dying, there are a lot of protections. So that's a tough thing to do. Second of all, children are a protected population, also tough. And the third thing is doing research with families is tough because how do you measure change, right? And so then Dean White said, but Jonathan, don't you do family therapy with suicidal kids? I was like, I do. She's like, so why don't you be the one to make an empirically supported intervention? And I was like, wait a minute, me? How would I do that? And she said, well, go get a PhD and learn to be a researcher. I was like, I don't want to get a PhD. Like, that sounds terrible. But one thing led to the next, and I decided to go back for my PhD. So 2004, I started at the University of Pittsburgh. And then 2006, started thinking about the podcast. 2007 and 2008, I started my job at Temple University. 2015, I moved to Loyola. And 10 years later, here we are.
Well, it's an incredible story. And it's funny, I think that if you ask many people that have gotten into social work how they got into it, it's, some people knew that that's what they wanted to do, but a lot of folks say that social work kind of chose them, which sounds that way with you as well. Sometimes it grabs a hold of us and doesn't let us go.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
I was wondering, Charlie just put a comment in there. I was wondering if Charlie was in here, what you were talking about. Charlie he was a social work student of mine, but he kind of became disillusioned with it a little bit. And he got one of those interdisciplinary degrees that I served on where he went into emergency management and social work and kind of combined those together. But Charlie says, I'm so glad to hear that you not only noticed the gap of crisis management, but did something about it. It's such an important area to focus on in both social work and education, in social work education, both when working with clients and when supporting your coworkers and place of work throughout crisis situations. I also think, Charlie, you might want to listen to Dr. Singer's story and look out how you can get that PhD and put some of that stuff together. I think you'd be perfect.
There you go. Well, I will say, so Charlie, the idea of crisis work is still one of these things that is under researched in social work. And this book, this is the Crisis Intervention Handbook. This is the 5th edition, and it is still one of the few texts that is social work specific and addresses crisis. So, if you have any interest in trying to answer some questions about, how can we do better with crisis services, or how can we make sure that crisis services are working for folks in crisis, or what are some different ways that we can think of crisis services for different issues, there is a ton of research that needs to be done in that area, and learning how to do it, like learning the methods and then answering the questions, is something that will have enormous payout for the profession. So if you're interested, I'd be happy to talk to you about it, but talk to Professor Ace, talk to anybody else. I think getting a Ph.D. in anything having to do with crisis work and social work is invaluable.
There you go, Charlie. There's your seed. I think it's germinating in there for you. But yeah, Charlie, reach out to me or Dr. Singer or both of us. He'll be visiting out here actually in a couple of months, so we can talk about it then. Let's talk about suicide for a little bit. I have not that much experience working with suicide. However, a while back, I don't know, 15 years ago or something, I got recruited to be a applied suicide intervention skills training, I think assist. I'm not even sure if it's still around. It probably is.
Oh yeah, it's one of the best.
Yeah, and so I went around and I was training people up in the North Slope in Alaska, so up on the Arctic Ocean, and we were holding assist trainings. And one of the interesting things for me that I learned about, I think, it's funny when you look back on certain things and like you didn't even know what a vocabulary word was or something. And I remember the word ambivalence. It was new to me when I went through that assist. Ambivalence, what does that mean? I use it now with like double-sided reflections and all that. But ambivalence, learning that, when you're talking to somebody that you think may be thinking about suicide, it can be uncomfortable. You think, well, I don't want to ask them that because they're going to be offended, or, what if I'm wrong? And this or that. But one of the things that I learned in there was that doesn't the research actually show that folks that are thinking about suicide want you to ask them, and they would prefer that you don't beat around the bush and that you talk to them about it. Curious your thoughts on that, and also just what the intervention that you were talking about in your dissertation.
Yeah, 100%. So ambivalence, which I had the wrong definition until I started working in the field of suicide prevention. So I always thought of ambivalence as I'm not interested in that, right? But actually ambivalence means that in the world of suicide, that part of you wants to live and part of you wants to die, right? There's this ambivalence about life, right? There's this duality. And, and that's one of the concepts that I think is so important for people to understand in the field of suicide prevention. And when talking with somebody who might be suicidal, is that if you're able to speak to the part of them that wants to die, to acknowledge that, to validate it, and at the same time, honor and validate the part that wants to live, you're engaging the whole person. And that is a rare experience because oftentimes people who are suicidal don't feel like they can talk about the part of them that thinks that this world is not for them. And so they hide that. Or that if they do bring it up, it'll be shut down. And so really to hold space for that in and of itself can be therapeutic. And so I think that's really powerful. Now, your follow-up question about the dissertation work that I did. It turns out I didn't do a dissertation on family-based interventions for suicidal youth. That came afterwards. I ended up working with Guy Diamond, who was one of the co-developers of attachment-based family therapy. He was in Philadelphia. I was teaching at Temple University. We connected, and I worked with him on his NIMH-funded clinical trial of attachment-based family therapy compared to family-enhanced non-directive supportive therapy. And I learned from that experience that I did not want to be involved in clinical intervention research. It was quite the realization for me because what I learned was that if you are the PI, the principal investigator of a clinical intervention trial, you cannot do the therapy. You have to train someone else to manage the therapist, to do the therapy. And what you end up doing is you end up spending a lot of time talking with the biostatistician, the grants manager. You end up managing your employees, who are the people doing the therapy. And I thought, you know what? I'm a clinician researcher. And I'm not saying Guy isn't. He absolutely is. He's a phenomenal therapist. He's made a brilliant contribution to the field. But I just didn't want to do the administrative work that it takes to run a clinical trial. Instead, where I found that my skills were more in dissemination and training. And so that's what I ended up doing around that. So now I will also say that in addition to the family work, I ended up in Philadelphia meeting Terry Erbacher, who ended up being my co-author for the book Suicide in Schools. And this was a book that it was Terry's idea. She's a school psychologist, and she came to me one day and she said, "Hey, is there a book that provides school professionals with kind of off the shelf insights into how to work with kids who might be suicidal, who've attempted, schools where a kid has died by suicide?" And I said, "No." And she's like, "Well, let's write one." So again, it was one of those moments, kind of like my conversation with David Springer and Barbara White, where there was a gap. And instead of being like, I hope somebody does something about it, she's like, we should do it. And so we wrote this book called Suicide in Schools that has ended up changing the trajectory of my career. And now I spend a lot of time training folks at the state level, at school districts, consulting with school districts around the issue of how do we think about building whole school, soup to nuts programs around both preventing suicide, but also making sure that the schools are places that kids want to go, where they feel affirmed, where who they are matters. Because we can't have a world that says that your life matters if we have a society that says that some lives are worth more than others. And so making sure that we are acknowledging how high level politics and local community level issues are affecting the one-on-one work that school folks do. It's essential, particularly when the stakes are so high as to have somebody decide that they no longer want to be part of this world.
Yeah. What are some of the ways that the educators and social workers and whatnot that are working with students, how can we help them feel more included, more sense of belonging?
You mean, how can educators help youth feel that?
Yes.
Yeah. So there are lots of ways. Some of them are kind of strictly educational or pedagogical, right? And some of these ways have absolutely come under attack in politics. And some of those ways include making sure that the school libraries have books that represent the diversity and variety of lived experiences, right? So that can be books where there are two moms. That can be books where you have people speaking different languages, whose customs are different, whose religious beliefs, whose physical abilities, whose everything, right? So like books is one way. Having that integrated into curricula is another. One of the things that I was guilty of for many years, I would go around and I'd talk about youth suicide. And the only time I talked about LGBTQ youth was when I was talking about their higher rates of suicide ideation and attempt. And what I realized was I was inadvertently contributing to the narrative that queer youth should expect to be more likely to die, right? And that I was ignoring kind of the beautiful, magical, amazing lives that queer youth have and will have as adults. Not to ignore the ways that society very sort of kind of subtly and explicitly diminishes and sometimes erases existence of identities. But to say that this is, your life matters. And so in the curriculum, in the classroom, in the conversations, that there is no sort of tokenism about conversation around any particular identity or lived experience, but rather it's just integrated. Now, I also tell schools that their work is one piece of the puzzle, but when you have kids who are coming home from school and their parents have been to their faith community and their faith community has been saying things or not saying things, that can have a huge impact on what goes on at home. It can create a rift between the kids and the parents, or the family and the schools. And so this is part of the reason why we go into the communities. And we, in the field of suicide prevention, we say, look, faith leaders need to bring up suicide from the pulpit, right? Not just in September, which is Suicide Prevention Month, but needs to be integrated into sermons, need to be integrated into conversation so that folks can say this issue of life and death, which faith communities are a huge part in many people's conceptions of what a meaningful life is and how to understand death, that if we're not talking about that in these faith communities in a way that makes sense and that people can see, oh, so pastor so-and-so or rabbi so-and-so or the imam or whatever it is, that people talked about this, right? And maybe it's okay for me to talk about it too, right? So doing that means that it becomes a community endeavor and that the school is part of the community in that sense. And again, it's not just faith communities in schools, it's after school activities, it's sports teams, it's the workplace, right? It's everywhere. But that's one of the ways that we can holistically think about addressing youth suicide as something that isn't just the one-on-one interaction where you're able to look at the kid and say, sometimes when kids are going through things that are like so terrible, they have thoughts of wanting to end their lives, even if that's not something they would normally do. And I'm just wondering if that's ever happened to you. Right. That's a beautiful kind of way of, Sean Shea calls that shame attenuation as a technique. Right. But like, that's a beautiful one-on-one way of asking that question. That only gets you so far. Right. If the outside world is then saying, yeah, but you don't matter. Right. We don't care if you exist in this world. And so I think one of the big things that schools can do, and one of the things that adults can do, is to ensure that kids know that their lives are worth living.
Yeah. It's such a deeply ingrained, some of the ways of viewing queer LGBTQ plus youth in general, they're so deeply rooted in our country. And I'm currently reading this book by, what's his name, Tim Weiner, about the FBI, the history of the FBI. And I'm reading about it. And I really had no idea how the depths and the lengths that they went to, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, against anybody that they would perceive to be homosexual. They tie them to the Communist Party and so on. I had no idea. And so if you think about, the past generations or the older generation now, that's the stuff that they grew up in, and they would have been in all that propaganda. And so in some ways it's hard to even blame them because, it's like I said, it's so deeply rooted, and there was so much under the table propaganda that was going on that people don't know what to believe and what not to believe, if you know what I mean.
Well, and to your point, right? So if we think about one of my favorite podcast episodes from This American Life is called 81 Words. And it's an episode about how what they called homosexuality was removed from the DSM as a psychiatric disorder. It tells the story of what led up to that. So if you think that until 1973, it was literally a psychiatric disorder on the same level as schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, pedophilia, homosexuality, right? Like that's what people grew up thinking. You couldn't be a psychiatrist if you were a homosexual. You couldn't be on the police force. You couldn't be a lawyer. There are all these things that all the doors were closed to you, right? And so if you grew up in that era and you didn't question it, which most people didn't, then at that time, it would be as if you were not questioning something today, right? Like we're going to look back. This is what I always tell my students. I'm like, if we're doing our job, you will look back on what you thought, like in 40 years, you're going to look back on what you thought today and you're going to think, man, how did I get it so wrong, right? How could I have thought that? How could I have held this bias? How could I have done this, right? Like if we're doing our job, that's what's going to happen. But yeah, that was the water that the fish swam in, right? And so I think critiquing people and understanding, the sort of the sins of the past is important. And I also think that having the context for understanding how and why folks believed what they believed is really important. So that book about the FBI and how it was embedded, about psychiatry, about so many other things, I think it's so important. Yeah, I could go off on this, but so I'm gonna stop though.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it up here in just a second. I have an interesting question for you about guns. It's a topic right now for various reasons. I saw you post some things about it. What do you know what the data shows about youth suicide and how often guns are play a role in that?
Yeah, so for youth ages 12 and under, the most common method of suicide is hanging and suffocation. Starting at age 13 on, firearms are the most lethal means for the rest of lifespan. 55% of all suicide deaths are with a firearm, even though about 6% of suicide attempts are with a firearm. And the reason is because firearms are so lethal. 2/3 of all firearm deaths are suicides. So when we think about access to lethal means, when we talk about firearms, oftentimes the conversation sort of revolves around homicide and firearms, but actually suicide is the most common death with a firearm by far.
And I bring it up because it's an important topic for me. I have a friend I mentioned living up north in Utqiagvik on the Arctic Ocean with the Nupiaq community, and I had a friend who was one of the most like when you move to a new town and it's a people are different and it's hard to get into. This guy waved me down across the parking lot and just came and introduced himself, and we became best friends. Well, 20 plus years later, he shot himself just recently in the last couple months. He's no longer.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, thank you. He's no longer with us, and he had some problems and whatnot. But I look at a lot of my adult history is in Alaska and Hawaii, and in Hawaii they do have some hunting and things like that, but it's very hard to get your hands on a gun. I don't have the data right here in front of me, but the rates of gun violence, obviously, and suicide by gun are much lower than that in Alaska, which is very high. And I think of my friend, and I don't know if he would have done something else or went to a different length, but I do know that up there in the Arctic for a good reason, they have subsistence and things like that, but you can go find a gun anywhere. You could go just walk in they call it a Kunichuk, the Arctic entryway to keep the cold air coming in. You could go open the door and pretty much find a rifle anywhere. And so I'm not saying take away all the guns or anything like that. I'm saying that it's a discussion that should obviously be had. And I think Hawaii and Alaska is are good places for comparison because the laws are so different and the results are so different, if you know what I mean. What do you think about what can we do to reduce it? Because there's so many guns in America, no matter where you're at for that.
Yeah.
Right? So.
Well, I mean, so I think that the research is pretty clear. And if you look at the work from Mike Anestis and some other folks, when you have state laws that slow the process down for getting firearms, so that means like waiting periods and background checks, that in and of itself reduces suicide deaths. Again, waiting periods and background checks do not in and of themselves prevent people from obtaining firearms, although there are some people for whom it would. But what it does is it buys time. And we know that in suicide prevention, time is an important intervention. That the more time there is between the impulse to end your life and the time that you can actually do it, it significantly decreases the likelihood that you're going to go through with it. And so in the United States, I don't imagine a future where we will be able to ban guns like they've done in other countries, right? Second Amendment would preclude that. But if we can have state laws that say, you want a gun? That's fine. We'll do background check, 72-hour waiting period, week-long waiting period. Take a class, get a license. It's going to take you 3 months. That would significantly reduce the suicide by firearm rate. Another thing that reduces it is if there is safe storage, because kids get access to their parents' guns. They get access to their neighbors' guns, and they kill themselves with those guns. And, when you have firearms being the leading cause of death by suicide for youth 13 and over, anything we can do to restrict access to guns. And again, 13 to 18, these are kids that can't have their own guns, right? These are somebody else's guns. And so there are things that we can do to restrict access that are life-saving.
Yeah, I appreciate that. What do you think about, one more quick question on that is, what do you think about like culturally? It seems to me that part of that reason that we're so accepting of all the violence is because we become desensitized to it. You grow up all of your life seeing it on TV, movies. I think, You can't see a naked person on whatever the main stations are these days, but you can sure
right.
see a lot of violence.
Well, yeah. And I mean, you go online and you can see, Charlie Kirk being shot in the neck 1,000 times over. I think that there's a headline that the Onion releases every time there's a firearm shooting. So I've seen it hundreds of times at this point, and it's basically, the headline is something like, "Can't do anything about this, says only country where this happens on a regular basis." Right. And I think one of the issues is that we have um, a conversation that revolves around restricting freedom. When you look at the legislation that's been passed around like red flag laws or emergency removal, right, of firearms, these are usually bipartisan because Republicans and Democrats alike have been able to get behind the idea that nobody wants somebody to use a firearm to end their life, right? There is no Second Amendment argument for a well-armed militia can then kill itself. That just doesn't fly. Nobody's going to make that argument. So that doesn't fit. So I actually think that suicide prevention is actually the one topic that we can actually get some movement on in terms of firearm safety in this country, because nobody wants it. Nobody wants suicide, even if they really want guns.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And it should bring us together, as should other things. Well, Dr. Singer, it's been a pleasure. And I want to thank everyone in the audience as well. And I just want to thank you for your wisdom, for your time, for your experience, very generously shared with us today. I want to leave you with one question, speaking to the name of the podcast, The Critical Social Worker. What does social work need to do better? Where would you, if you could imagine it in the future, what would be different about it that would improve it upon where we're at today?
I wish we had another hour and a half, Ace. So I think there are a couple things. One, when we look at micro level services, direct services, one of the things that we don't do well is we don't have a good way of understanding how well our clients are improving, right? What is it that is going to let us know that we are sort of on the right path to our clients no longer needing services? I think this is an ethical issue. It's an economic justice issue. It's a workforce issue. I think more at a macro level, one of the things that social work needs to do is to come to terms with the fact that we don't actually understand what social justice is. We throw the term around a lot, and we, at various stages of our careers profession, we have aligned it with a cause or an action, but it's part of our code of ethics. And yet you have people who I think you and I would probably say that we have met who are doing social justice work, but actually that work conflicts with each other, right? So I think that as a profession on a macro level, coming to terms with that idea would be amazing. And I think would strengthen the profession enormously.
Yeah. I appreciate it, Dr. Singer. Jonathan, it's been a pleasure. Again, thank you very much for generously giving us your time and your wisdom and your experience today. I really, really appreciate it. And it's been a pleasure getting to know you.
Thank you, Professor Ace. It has been an honor and pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
All right. Take care and have a great day.